Thanks very much for joining today, everybody. Our virtual boardroom. My name's Jo Thompson and I work for HR Recruit. So today's session, Employers' Rights to COVID Vaccinations, is actually going to be run by Yvonne Saxon. So I'll hand you over to Yvonne now and let Yvonne introduce herself in the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, I'm Yvonne Saxon. I work for Vista Employer Services. So I'm the head of HR there, but all of my colleagues are employment lawyers. So on a day-to-day basis, I get very involved in the stuff that they do. And over the past 12 months, have got even more involved in that when we've been talking about all things COVID related. And it's actually 1 year to the day today that the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. And who'd have thought just over a year ago that we'd be sitting here today talking about whether employers might actually make it mandatory for employees to have vaccinations to come to work. So an awful lot's happened since then. And I've put together some slides to walk through with you today. Myself and the lawyers that I work with have been talking about pathways for achieving this. And so I'll share this with you and we'll also get it sent out to you after the session today as well. If there's any questions, then please use the chat function and we'll see if we can pick some of those up at the end of the session. Okay. So I'll just try and, in time-honoured fashion with these things now, I'll try and get my screen to share. And hopefully that should be coming up now for everybody. Is that there, Jo? Great. I can't see it here, so that's fantastic. So basically, what we're all here for is to talk about whether can employers actually insist on employees having the vaccination. And at the beginning of this year, Pimlico plumbers came out and said, no jab, no job. And you'll remember the headlines in the press about this. There was lots of commentary on the legals and whether that would be enforceable or not, etc., etc. And as time's moved on, there's been a bit of a shift in people's thought processes around mandatory vaccination. So we've got travel companies now saying that people won't be able to travel with them unless they're vaccinated. We've also got concert venues and football stadiums saying, well, actually, they may be requiring people to evidence vaccination as well. So the thought processes are shifting a little bit and more employers are starting to ask the question, well, actually, could we insist on this? And the short answer to that is potentially yes. But a lot of that depends upon what your business objectives are. As an employer, what are your rights in regard to those business objectives? And balancing that against discrimination legislation and human rights. And if you work in the public sector, there'll be an even higher bar around the human rights element of it. And then also whether you have got the alignment with a duty of care about protecting your workforce and the reasons behind that as well, aligning with your business objectives. So we talk very much about a pathway and what would be the best pathway to enable employers to get there if they really did have a business need for insisting on vaccination. So the first element really of that, and everything will hinge on this, is what is your business case? You really need to put every effort possible into considering what it is that you're trying to achieve and why are you trying to achieve that? Why is it so important for your organisation to have people vaccinated? Now, we all know that you can't physically walk up to anybody in your workplace and just jab them in the arm, you know, that would be assault. So we can't really go round about it in that way. So what employers are talking about is saying, well, actually, how can we insist that for people to come to work, they have, you know, that they have to be vaccinated? So we have to think about, is this business case is vaccinating people, is requiring people to be vaccinated proportionate to you achieving the aims that you need to achieve? Are there other ways of going about it? And interestingly, one of the travel companies, Saga, who run cruises, are demanding that all their customers have COVID vaccinations before they go on the cruise. But they're not demanding that their staff do. But the only reason why they've not started to go down that route is because of the complexity, because they employ people from all over the world. So trying to demand COVID vaccination of people from all around the world is just too complex for them. But they have found another way. And the other way is that they are going to make sure that all of their staff quarantine for 14 days before their cruise leaves port. So that's just looking at that as a balance in there, as to, you know, that they're demanding their clients are vaccinated, but not their staff, because they found another way around that. Once you've established a business case, then it's looking about what's the impact of that. So you need to do an impact assessment. So what are the implications if you do go down this route? What kind of things potentially might happen in your organisation? What employee relations issues might occur? All of those kinds of things you need to start to analyse and start to consider. What are those things that might come up so that you're prepared for it? And it's also worth doing an impact assessment of, well, what if you don't go down the mandatory route? What's the potential impact for you there? Because that may actually feed back in to your business case and your business need. Other things to think about are the types of clients that you may have as an organisation, and whether there's going to be any third-party pressure there. So one of our clients, they very much work alongside healthcare, surgical healthcare environments. And so some of their employees already have to be vaccinated against other diseases in order to go to the clients. Thinking about that, that's a frontline role. So there's a lot about what are the roles involved in whether you're going to demand vaccination. So are people working on that front line? Are people working in healthcare? What about if you are an organisation that has a requirement for some of your employees to travel internationally? And part of that travel is going to mean that they're going to have to be vaccinated to undertake that travel, part of their job. But how realistic is it to say, well, actually, we're going to mandate vaccination across all of our organisation just because we've got frontline people or people travelling? Because you may not actually need it for back office. But that said, there's been an awful lot of statistics published recently about some of the riskiest workplaces for catching COVID seems to be in office environments. Another consideration is the GDPR implications. So if you're going to start to say to people, we demand evidence from you that you've been vaccinated, and what are you going to do with that information then? Where are you going to hold that information? Where are you going to share that information? How are you going to process that information? So there's all these privacy rights that you'll need to think about in terms of looking at that data that you're going to handle. And then the other point that we really need to be considerate of is the current state. So the current situation we have with the vaccine is that we actually don't know yet whether the vaccine will prevent transmission to other people. They're still researching that. We currently only have limited data on what is the protection rate of the vaccine when people have only had one dose, for example. So there's lots of things still developing. So business cases will have to take into account what the research is telling us, what the science is telling us, what the medical profession is telling us, and also considering what are the parameters of what we've got in place at the moment for protecting the COVID safe working practices that are in place. So all of those factors need to be taken into consideration for this business case. That's the starting point. Once you've got a business case and you feel, well, we're going to move forwards with this, then we need a pathway of how we're going to move forwards with it. And when we've been talking about this in our team, we very much based this on the police's approach to how they're managing COVID issues. And this is very much around engage, explain, and encourage. So for you as an organisation, whether you're going to go down a mandatory route or not, it probably seems a good idea to actually promote to people the health and safety and well-being benefits of being vaccinated, promote why it's good for them as an individual, why it's good for everybody else in the workplace as well. If you are going to encourage people and you're going to try and get people to take up the vaccine voluntarily, then have you thought about what you're going to do about giving people time off for vaccination appointments? Of course, you can't have a whole shift all going at the same time, and some people may need to rearrange around that. But it's about the organisation being supportive of people being able to go and get those vaccines. Now, fortunately, to the best of my knowledge, very few people have any serious side effects from the vaccine. Most people tend to have a bit of a sore arm. I know my mum, when she had hers, she just didn't feel quite right for a couple of days. She was a bit tired and she didn't feel quite right. But there's, we're human beings and there's always potential for side effects. So as an employer, if somebody has gone out there and gone to get the vaccine, but then is unfortunate enough to suffer some side effects from that, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to pay them full pay? Are you going to make sure that any of those kind of side effects, absences, will sit outside your absent management triggers? Many employers right now are trying to gauge what the situation feels like in their workforce. And so they're conducting surveys, anonymous surveys, just to be able to get a picture of, well, actually, what might the take-up rate be? There was a Glassdoor survey this morning that was published that said 56% of employees that were surveyed have said that they will want to get the vaccine. They think it's right that people have the vaccine before they go into the workplace. That's really positive. But we may get other workplaces where people feel very differently. And so getting a survey done and understanding and asking the questions, if people don't want to get vaccinated, why that might be. So that again, you can look at how you as an organisation can perhaps engage with people and encourage them and overcome some of those barriers for them. And that moves us very much into this consulting phase of consulting with people. Well, actually, how can we get people to take up the vaccine? How can we actually get people to move forwards with that? And as an organisation, if we're thinking about making it mandatory, then of course you're going to have to consult with people. The next stage really is looking at those objections that come through from there. And as an organisation, legally, you really need to give conscious consideration to what any of those objectives may be, rather than dismissing anything out of hand. Many people at the moment are also talking about whether they should be putting a policy into place. We've been debating this, and actually we feel that, to be honest, having a policy right now is probably not the best idea. That's probably something for much further down the line, just because so much is still developing in this area. There's still so much that's unknown. So it would be better to wait before you put a policy together to make sure that we've got more information about how this situation is developing. And of course, if the engage and explain and encourage don't work, then the police move to enforcement. And it's easier to enforce a rule of you have to have a jab to get a job for a new starter. It's my house, it's my rules. If you want to come and work here, then you're going to have a vaccination. But it's not quite as simple as that, because there's potential discriminatory issues there. There will be a number of people who will not be able to have the vaccination for medical reasons. There will be people who will not want to have the vaccination because they're planning to start a family, and currently the advice is that they're not sure about the vaccination for people who are about to get pregnant. So there's all those kind of things to think about. And one of the pieces of advice that I would give is that if you've got people, if you're recruiting and you've got somebody who says, well, I'm not going to get a jab, rather than dismissing that out of hand and potentially finding yourself in a discriminatory situation, you'd be better off trying to establish why it is that they're not wanting to have that, and not making that part of your decision as to whether you shortlist them or not. When you've got objections in your current workforce, it's how are you going to get through those? And of course, if you're unionised, then there's going to be a collective discussion, and there's going to be some conciliation, some negotiation going on there with them. And at an individual level, it's who is objecting to it, and why is that objection reasonable? Are there health issues? What are the issues that you might be able to work through with them? And if you can't work through with them, what are you going to do? Now, there's many people that are talking about whether they would discipline people and say that actually this is going to end up being a termination for failure to follow a reasonable management instruction. Our view is slightly different to that, because this isn't really a disciplinary issue as such. We see it much more as almost as some other substantial reason why you might terminate their employment. Because if you're saying that it's necessary to have a vaccination to work here, and if somebody can't apply that, then that's the reason why their job is being terminated. It's a bit like somebody needing a driving license to be a driver for a driving job. It's along those lines. But before you move into termination, you would need to think about alternatives. Is there an alternative role that wouldn't need somebody to have the vaccination? Could somebody work from home? All these different things need to be taken into consideration. But if you're looking at anything to do with enforcement, then of course it's really, really important that you take legal advice. Every organisation is unique. Roles within organisations are unique. Circumstances within people's lives are unique. And so it's really, really important that you make sure that you take legal advice as you walk through any enforcement. At the moment, we're in a situation where we're going through a transition as well for the vaccine. Not everyone can access the vaccine yet because it's done in age tiers. And I think currently we're at age 55 and above. So it's going to be quite some time before the younger end of your workforce are going to actually be able to access the vaccination. So for employers who are looking at a mandatory route, the question mark for them to be thinking about is, well, are you going to wait until all of those tiers for inviting people to be vaccinated are complete before you mandate? Or are you actually going to mandate it at the tiers as you go through them? Because a big question mark might be, well, if you mandate it at the end and you've got somebody who's in their late 50s now who's saying, well, I'm not going to have the jab, then at what point are you going to start to have those enforcement conversations with them? Because you're going to have to play catch up then with the whole workforce as you move through that. In this transition period, are you going to adjust duties until the end is reached? So potentially, if it's because it's really, really important and you're in the healthcare sector might it be that you want to make sure that the people who are at the front line are the people who have been vaccinated? And there's a flip side to this as well, in that you may, as an employer, have employees who aren't yet able to access the vaccine or can't access the vaccine, who are not happy about working alongside with people who have refused the vaccine. So even if you take a mandatory approach or not, you still may come across this in the workplace where people were saying, well, I'm not working with him because he's not had that vaccine. And so, there are things that you're going to have to consider. What are you going to do in those situations? Now, we have to bear in mind that the vaccine isn't really a replacement for the COVID safe measures that we've got in place at the moment. Even with the vaccine, we are still going to have to maintain social distancing. We are still going to have to maintain wearing masks in certain circumstances. The hand washing, the hand sanitizing, all of that is still going to go on for the foreseeable. We also don't know whether, if you have a vaccine now, is that going to protect you forever? Or are you going to have a vaccine every single year? So all of these things are still currently in development. So what I would say is that finally, that every organisation is unique. There's a unique set of circumstances with everybody that you'll have to work through carefully as to what's the right thing for you to do. I think communication, whether you go down the mandatory route or not, is really important. The benefits of the vaccine for people's health and well-being are really important. And the more that you start a conversation, if you start a conversation now, and the more that conversation develops, then your workforce start to talk about that more. And peer pressure is actually is pretty good in terms of convincing people sometimes who might at the moment be thinking of, I'm not going to go down that route. So everything's still developing, and I would very much recommend that you do engage, you do explain, and you do encourage, even if you're not going to enforce it, because I think it can only be a good thing for all of us if we've done everything that we can to try and protect our workforces and our workplaces. If you need any more information or any more help with things for your own organisation, then of course you can get in touch with us at Vista. We're really happy to help. But it is very much a developing situation, but it's one that probably you need to start thinking about now, even if you're not actually going to enforce it. So Jo, is there any questions that are coming through at the moment? Oh, sorry, you're on mute. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I just had the full screen on then. Bear with me. No, there's no messages at the moment, but if anyone's got any questions, do you want to just put them in the chat box? I would normally ask you to just unmute yourself and say them, but there's quite a lot of you on the call, and I'm conscious that we might get a few people talking at the same time. So if you've got any questions, do you want to just put them in the chat box, and then we can I can ask Yvonne and we can just discuss them. So Holly has asked Yvonne, what's the view on mandatory testing?
Oh, on testing. So on testing, it's probably fairly similar, really, because the government are encouraging employers to test. They're saying, we're making these tests freely available, but not every employer is going to go down the route of actually saying we require you to have these tests. Most employers have gone down the route of saying we'll make this available to you. We want to encourage you to have these tests. So I think, again, it's very much following the same pathway. If you want to mandate it and you want to say, well, actually, we don't want you to be in our workforce or at work if you are not going to be tested, then I think the same situation is going to apply. You're going to have to look at what is your business case. You're going to have to look at, is having the test a proportionate means of achieving what you want to achieve? And working through exactly that process, that pathway that I talked about the vaccination.
So James has put a comment on there saying about testing. Isn't it a reasonable management instruction to make the workplace safe?
There's a balance to be had, because testing in itself doesn't necessarily make the workplace safe. It's not 100%, because we all know that there've been false positive tests, there've been false negative tests. So it's not going to make it 100% safe. It's just another piece of the jigsaw that you're putting in place in addition to all the COVID measures that you've put in place. If you start to mandate it, you need a very good reason for doing that, because what are you going to do if somebody says, well, I don't want to have it? Because ultimately, if you're going to say to them, well, if you're not going to be tested, okay, well, we don't want you to come to work, we'll pay you to sit at home on full pay. Fine, no one's going to complain about that. But if you say to them, well, actually, you know, if you don't do this, we're going to sack you, then you're potentially looking at, you know, an unfair dismissal claim there, unless you can demonstrate that there is a very, very good business reason, and it's proportionate, and that there's no discriminatory aspects. So you've got quite a few hurdles to get through there. So again, it's exactly like I said with the vaccination route, that this needs to be proportionate.
Okay. So Anthony has asked, am I right that a company is not obliged to restructure its activities, staffing and operations where an employee's beliefs conflict with the employee's duties?
That's an interesting question, because it's about disrupting their operations because of an employee's beliefs. Now, if I interpret what's being asked there, I'm assuming that what they're saying is that if an employee says, I have a philosophical belief that a vaccination is damaging to me for whatever reason, and you can't make me do that. If the question is, well, does an organization have to change things around for that person? Well, it depends very much on the individual circumstances involved. It depends on the nature of the business. It depends on the nature of why the person is saying no to that. There's all these hurdles that we need to think about and look at carefully.
Okay, so Harriet has asked, what would your advice be if you had an employee who was considered vulnerable and they'd been vaccinated, and they started expressing concern about working with others who were not vaccinated?
And that's one that's probably going to come up quite a number of times. If the person themselves has been vaccinated, then that's one step that's already been put in place to try and protect them. As we've already said, we are already currently, and for we don't know how long, working with COVID safe measures. So if as a workplace you have got people who are not sitting near each other, you've got people that are at least 2 meters apart, you've got good ventilation, you've got all of these factors in place, you've done a good risk assessment, you've put all of these measures in place to protect somebody, and they've also had the vaccination, then there's not much else that you can do on the face of it. But this is about whether you feel as an organisation you need to make it mandatory. And if you're saying, well, as an organisation, we don't need to, but the issue is just purely about this one individual because they're objecting, then it's the same as when you've got any other objection about behaviours in the workplace. And it's working through it with that individual and working through it as to how can we protect you best then? You know, could they work from home? Could they work in an area where they're away from other people? It depends on the circumstances as to whether, you know, you can have safe distancing or not in that work environment.
Okay, I think we slightly touched on this in the presentation, but Beverly's asking, what would you do if someone refuses to work with a colleague who's not had a vaccination?
And that's a similar thing. I mean, if someone's refusing to work with somebody, it's pretty much in a similar lines as to what would you do about that right now? Because if somebody's refusing to work with somebody for all sorts of reasons, you need to go work through that with them and explore with them as to why that is. So you need to understand their reasons. Now, are their reasons just because they believe everybody's got to be vaccinated? Or is it because they have particular vulnerabilities? And then we're taking that step back again and looking at, well, how can we protect that person? But we've had this come up where I've personally dealt with clients who have had people who were refusing to work with other people because they know that they've been out partying over the weekend and not safe distancing and things like that. So it's the same kind of thing. Whatever steps you would take with an employee who's refusing to work with somebody else, you would work through that again, but bear in mind the health and safety implications. And there's so much that will sit behind that as to the unique circumstances.
Okay. Jana is asking, I'm not sure whether you're going to be able to answer this one or not. Does Vista have a view of what will happen if the vaccine turns out not to be effective, or if there's evidence that the vaccines, or if there becomes evidence that vaccine safety risks, they are unknown, but it could be an issue?
And I think that will come back to this, you know, when we talked about looking at the business case and looking at what is the scientific evidence right now. So if at any time you're saying, well, as a business, we believe we may mandate this. So if I say, for example, the easiest one to think about is the care sector, so care homes. You can understand why a care home might want to start taking those steps to go down a mandatory route. Now, if somewhere along the line there is some issue about the evidence, then of course organisations will have to revisit that. They'll have to look at that again. So this is a moving feast. This is going to keep moving, along with you know, we're getting new variants as well of COVID, and you know, are the vaccines going to keep up with those new variants? We don't know. So until we kind of get that information and we get that clarity, we don't really know what we're going to be able to argue with. So it's all about, we can only argue with what we can argue with at the time of what we know. And as things change, we'll have further discussion on that.
Okay. Anthony's asking, as part of our indemnity insurance, we are required to ask employees to complete health questionnaires on an annual basis. Can we ask about vaccinations as part of that process?
Now that's really interesting, because this will bring you back to the question, why are you asking them? And if they say yes or no, what are you going to do about it? Because the reason why you have a health questionnaire when somebody comes to work for your business is you're checking that this person can come and work for you safely. So it's very much about their safety rather than anyone else's when you do that. So if you were to be asking them whether they've had a vaccination in their general health questionnaire before they come and work for you, I'm not sure that it's really going to be that relevant.
Okay. Joe is asking, if you have frontline health workers looking after vulnerable people or people who are shielding, then surely you have to mandate compulsory testing and vaccination based on risk assessment.
In those areas, you have got a much stronger business case. I mean, there's no automatic, because the government haven't come out and said, right, the health sector can can automatically mandate this. Even the NHS haven't come out and said it. We know that they're talking about it, but nobody's come out and said it yet. This is going back to, if you're going to do it, if you're going to mandate it, you will have a much stronger business case for that if you are working in that kind of sector. But it doesn't mean to say that you don't need to do that hard work up front, because you will still need to do that business case and that hard work up front to demonstrate that you have thought about all of these things, that you've looked at whether that's proportionate, you've looked at whether there are other ways of achieving that. And if you have come to the conclusion that it's still going to be mandatory, have you then followed a reasonable process to actually implement that mandation? Is mandation a word?
It is now.
Anyway.
Okay, so Helen is saying, if collecting vaccinations data from employees is confidential, colleagues will not know who has or who has not had it. Is there a further GDPR issue here that you cannot disclose status or physically isolate an individual?
Yeah, and you're quite right there, because you're not going to be able to walk around the workplace and say, well, Fred's had it and John's not had it. That's not, you can't do that. This is sensitive information. The issue will be is that employees will talk amongst themselves. We all know that. We know that people share information with each other. If somebody is vulnerable or needs to work in a different environment, if we think, for example, what do we do at the moment if we need to make reasonable adjustments for somebody? We don't shout it from the rooftops necessarily, the reason why we're doing that. We do it. And I don't think this is any different. I think if you're making adjustments for people, then you will just do them in the same way that you will do them, done it previously. You don't need to tell everybody about it.
Okay, as there's a few comments from people who have had to leave. Has anyone else got any burning questions that they want to ask Yvonne? There's another one come up here. Okay, 1 second. Just bear with me. Nicola is asking, can our clients insist that our consultants have a rapid flow test before they come on site for a 2-hour meeting?
And this comes back to, it's the similar thing with the vaccination element of, it's this third party pressure, and it's about how reasonable is that. So, you know, a lot will depend on the individual circumstances. What I don't know here from a question like that is, what is your, you know, what is it that they're going on site for? What kind of environment is it? Why is that client demanding that? So it's all about what's reasonable. If that client has got a very, very strong reason for requiring people to have had a test before they come onto site, then it may well be that as a supplier to that client, you have to abide by that. But again, a lot of this is around the reasonableness of that.
Then just one final question come up. Should all recruitment health questionnaires be updated to include the question, are you considered to be CEV, and why?
I would say not, because at this moment in time, it's the individual that's going to come to the employer and say, I'm clinically vulnerable. So I wouldn't have necessarily thought about saying to people, well, are you extremely clinically vulnerable? Because it's almost a bit like saying, well, what have we got anything in questionnaires right now about whether somebody may be more susceptible to certain diseases or not? I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure on it, but at this moment in time, it doesn't feel quite right. I think it just sits within that area at the moment of, if somebody is vulnerable, they will know that. They will have, you know, they will have had advice, medical advice about that. And it's really for them to come to you and say, well, actually, I'm clinically vulnerable.
Okay, that's great. There's no other questions, Yvonne. I'm conscious of time. So I would just like to say thanks very much to everybody that's joined the boardroom. I hope you found it useful. A massive thanks to Yvonne. Really appreciate it. I think it's been a really good session. What I'm going to do this afternoon is I'm going to do a LinkedIn post just to say thanks very much, and I'm going to send everybody an email with the post. So I'd really appreciate it if you could put a comment to the LinkedIn post. As Yvonne said at the beginning of the session, she will send me a copy of these slides. So if anybody does want a copy of the slides, please put a comment to the LinkedIn post. We've also got a Guild app, which is like a networking group for HR professionals. I know that some of you who were on the call are already in the Guild group, but it's a bit like WhatsApp, and it's really informative. There's lots of discussion and questions asked, so I'll put a link in there if anybody would like to join that. And then we've obviously got additional boardrooms that are going on for the next few weeks, so I'll send you a link to those if anyone would like to sign up for any further sessions. And finally, obviously, if anyone is looking to recruit, bear us in mind. We've also got finance director recruit and accountancy recruit within the group as well, if any of other sectors within your organisation are looking to recruit. Any final words from you, Yvonne?
No, that's fine. Thank you so much for coming. And as I say, I'll send the slides over to Joe this afternoon. So if anybody wants them, you can have those. And if you want to get in touch to explore anything more, then really happy to.